Hello. I am not really consistent about the time for this, but oh well. Um, I have this really. There's a bakery near my house, and they always have rotating new pastries that I like. I really like to be the first one to try them. But today's the day the new ones come out, and it's a lemon pastry. I was just eating it, but it was so sour that I don't know. It was a little too sour for me. Okay, well, I am on page, let's see, 67, I believe. It was pretty good. The last time we were reading, it was all about him leaving his little entry level public service job and going to this just decrepit, marshy park and imagining what it could become. Um, let's see. And he was telling this woman named Miss Perkins about what the park could become. Okay, so this is him telling this lady about what the desolate land could be. Moses was to talk again to Miss Perkins. Every time he did, her astonishment grew. He was always burning up with ideas, just burning up with them, she was to say. Everything he saw walking around the city made him think of some way that it could be better. Happening once to comment that it was too bad that mothers who took infants to Central Park had to leave when diapers needed changing and go all the way home, she saw her idle words strike instant fire in Moses' mind. Why not build diaper changing shelters? He asked. They could be small structures, used for no other purpose. You wouldn't even need attendants. The cost would be small. Or perhaps they could be additions to comfort stations already built. The cost would be smaller yet. It should certainly be looked into. Moreover, not all the ideas that he told her about required concrete and steel. Bob Moses, she realized, had thought through detailed new concepts of city budget making and social welfare legislation, prison administration, and school administration, filing systems, and methods of conducting public hearings. Also, so depressing that it's been 8 days and this is how far I am. Someone commented last time that I should read the DSM 5 next. I will not be doing that. But while Francis Perkins was impressed by Moses's imagination, the Bureau was more impressed by his impatience. Challenged at staff meetings about some details of those of his ideas that he had presented, he responded as Bella, his mom, did at Madison House board meetings, making it clear that he wasn't much interested in long discussions. The ideas were good. What he needed was to put them into practice. Impatience became frustration. Moses wanted the Bureau to take up his ideas officially at once and press the city to adopt them. The Bureau had other projects on which it was already working and which it considered equally important. When it got to Moses's projects, they would have to be thoroughly studied. And as to those suggestions about public works projects like the highway, well, the ABC was not at all certain that the Bureau had the expertise or the responsibility to start suggesting public works. ABC is the trio of guys that run the Bureau of Municipal Research, which is like the check to make sure everyone's using their budget correctly. And they call themselves the ABC because their names start with A, B, and C. Super cute. The frustration boiled over. Moses became more and more critical of some of the Bureau's own procedures, which he felt were keeping it from accomplishing as much as it could. This criticism, offered with conspicuous lack of tact by one of the newest members of the Bureau, rubbed senior staffers the wrong way. They felt the procedures had brought the Bureau success. They were particularly incensed at several of Moses's suggestions aimed at speeding up the preliminary work that went into reports. While Bruer felt he's the B of the ABC, felt that some of these suggestions were worth looking into, Cleveland and Allen were more precise, careful men who believed in checking every possible aspect of a situation before writing anything about it. And most of the staffers agreed with this philosophy. The reaction to rebuff was not graceful. Moses's irritation with the Bureau began to spill over into his work. He didn't feel it was important anymore. Investigations didn't accomplish anything. He didn't want to count barrels of concrete. He wanted to pour them. He had said the weekly staff luncheons were a waste of time. The Bureau, believing they were valuable for interchange of ideas, declined to eliminate them. So Moses simply stopped attending. With increasing frequency, sent over to City Hall to get material for a report, he would return without the material and say he had met one of the city officials he knew, and we had a very interesting conversation. Acting as an advisor to several training school students, Moses developed the habit of writing large question marks in the margins of the reports next to statements he questioned, and the papers were returned with their margins literally filled with the indications of his displeasure. Sometimes the papers were not returned at all. I have your memorandum, and it's no damn good, he would say to a student. I threw it in the wastebasket, and the student would find out that Moses meant exactly that. The memo had actually been thrown away. The student would never see it again. Uh, he used his tongue as a lash on his advisees. One, considered a brilliant prospect and in fact later to become one of the country's leading experts on police administration, emerged from a conference with Moses so depressed that he gave up his hopes of a public career and resigned from the bureau. It was only with difficulty that he was persuaded to return. Breuer, who knew Bella and Emmanuel Moses socially, stayed tolerant toward their son, but Cleveland and Allen made it clear they were not prepared to put up with his behavior much longer. Moses, they said, just couldn't seem to learn to work as part of a team. Bureau gossip said he would be fired shortly. Dun dun dun. Only one person at the Bureau was sympathetic. She was a woman who worked as Cleveland's secretary. Mary Louise Sims was slim, of less than medium height, and rather plain, but gay and vivacious. With ash blonde hair and clear white skin, she looked fresh and clean. She came from Dodgeville, Wisconsin, one of the 6 children of a Cornishman who worked in the little town's lead and zinc mines. Okay, completely unrelated aside, I'm sorry, but in Wisconsin and also the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, there were a bunch of Cornish immigrants in the 1800s because they're miners and there's a bunch of mines up there in the upper Midwest. And so it's like an interesting subculture. I remember going on a road trip there as a kid and there's like Cornish pasties, which are like dumpling type things made, but like pastry dumpling type things, but it's apparently similar to Cornwall. Anyway, yeah, so that wasn't relevant to the book, and sorry if my little comments bother you, just say something in the chat and then I will stop doing them. After she graduated and began to work full-time in Madison, the state capital, a portion of her earnings each week was still put aside for college tuition for a younger sister. In Madison, Mary was a secretary, but that was not an adequate description of the work she did. Her employer was Francis McGovern, the governor of Wisconsin. McGovern is the governor. And he noticed that Mary had an instinct for and insight into politics, including the merciless infighting that was part of the decor in any state house. He used her as a confidant and advisor. But Mary's ambitions were not for herself. She had sought out a job with a politician not because she was interested in politics, but because she was interested in what politics could do. She was another of the moths who, in the years before World War I, hovered so thickly around the flame of idealism. In 1913, Cleveland and Allen visited Madison to study Wisconsin's governmental structure. No one could explain it better than Miss Sims. No one could explain it better than Miss Sims, the governor said, and delegated her to show the visitors around. She had already become interested in the efficiency and economy movement. In the course of the tour, Cleveland and Allen talked to her about how they were trying to make democracy work, about fighting to free government to institute reforms that would really help people. Mary resigned as the governor's secretary and came to New York to work for the Bureau. In 1914, she was 34 and a half years older than Bob Moses, and was known to Bureau staffers and students for her friendliness, her quick wit, and the depth of her belief in what they were doing. Bob Moses fell in love with her. She's 34 years older than him. This is a crazy moment. This is a really crazy moment. Although women had always been attracted to him, Moses had never before, although he was 25 years old, centered attention on any particular one. But now he talked about Mary constantly, and he talked about her in terms that left no doubt that the pedestal he had placed her on was a high one. The lover of the good, the true, and the beautiful seemed to feel he had found their embodiment. He was, a friend said, very, very much in love. I can't figure out if she's 34 and a half or 60. His devotion was complete. Taking Mary along on his walks around the city, he poured out to her his ideas and frustration at the indifference with which they were received by the Bureau. At the Bureau, they would meet in the library among the books, and they would sit and talk for hours. He introduced her to his friends. They noticed that she was always gay and happy and laughing, but that she could also, in a quiet way, deliver a remark that could demolish any opponent's arguments. Or an opponent. The Bureau's whisperers soon learned that it was unwise to let Mary hear of their criticisms of Moses. If she did, she would not hesitate to let them know where, despite her feelings for the Bureau, her first loyalties now lay. They just didn't understand Bob, she would say. One day, he would get a chance to show what he could do. And, as it turned out, the chance came soon. Having finally accepted the Fusion nomination, John Peroy Mitchell had been elected mayor of New York City on November 4, 1913, at the age of 34. Breuer had become his closest confidant, the expert who provided the tinder to fuel Mitchell's zeal. Breuer provided the facts and theories, Allen was to say, and Mitchell took fire with them. Now, as mayor, Mitchell made Breuer city chamberlain. City chamberlain is a position. And he asked the Bureau to list the city departments most in need of reorganization and to recommend the Bureau experts equipped to advise on their reorganization. Near the top of the Bureau's list was the Municipal Civil Service Commission, and Allen, Breuer, and Cleveland found that the only one staffer in the Bureau was an expert on civil service. They had no choice but to submit his name to Mitchell, and when, in 1914, the mayor appointed a new Civil Service Commission, he asked the commissioners to rely for technical assistance on this man and to regard him as if he were in fact on the city payroll. The new commissioners found the man a more than willing assistant. At last, he was being given a chance to participate in the actual workings of the government itself, in workings that could change men's lives, in workings that could make a city a better place to live. Okay, if you're just coming in, we're in the chapter where he's just starting out civil service, and he's just getting, it looks like we're in the middle of a paragraph that makes it seem like he's about to get his big break, like he's about to get appointed to an actual powerful position. Also, he's having a love affair with a woman who it's unclear to me if she's 34 or if she's 34 years older than him. Still figuring that out. Okay, into the work of the Municipal Civil Service Commission, Bob Moses hurled all his energy and all his brilliance, all his zeal for reform, all the long pent-up enthusiasm and fire of the boundless idealism of his youth. The first wife was born in 1885. I think that makes her like 10 years older than him, right? Which would make her be like 34 and a half at the time that they're dating, because he was 25. I think it's a 10-year age gap, but I'm not sure. The way it's written is really confusing. So far, this book is a masterpiece, except for the that line, which was confusing to me. Okay, new chapter. Chapter 5. Age of Optimism. In setting out to reform New York City's civil service, Bob Moses was setting out to break into the plunder house of politics. The wheels of the Tammany war machine might be greased with money, but the machine was pulled by men. The men who voted Democratic themselves, the men who rounded up newly arrived immigrants and brought them in to be registered Democratic. The men who, during election campaigns, rang doorbells and distributed literature to those immigrants and to their own friends and neighbors, and on election day shepherded them to the polls to vote Democratic. What? She was 3 years older than him? I don't know. I don't think it's worth going back and figuring out why I thought she was 60 years old when they started dating, but that's what I thought for a minute. Thank you so much for clearing that up. Okay, Tammany Hall. And the most succulent of the carrots that lured these men forward, that kept their shoulders braced against the ropes that pulled the Tammany machine, was the carrot of jobs. Jobs for themselves, jobs for their wives, jobs for their sons. The only source of jobs on the scale required was the city itself. So the jobs Tammany had to control in order to control the city were the city's jobs. Positions as policemen, firemen, sanitation workers, court clerks, process servers, building inspectors, secretaries, clerks. There were, in 1914, 50,000 city employees, and this meant 50,000 men and women who owed their paychecks and whose families owed the food and shelter those paychecks bought, not to Merritt, but to the ward boss. Patronage was the coinage of power in New York City, and the reforms of the civil service, such as Moses was to propose, were therefore daggers thrust at the heart of Tammany Hall. Tammany understood this well, and Tammany knew how to defend itself. It always had. One thing in this book, I know like vaguely that Tammany Hall is a political thing in New York that has a lot of power. It's a group. This book doesn't really talk about what Tammany Hall is, maybe because when it was written in the mid 70s, it was more known, but I feel like I really need to go on Wikipedia and just like read the lead first few paragraphs about Tammany Hall because I don't think I know nearly enough. Reformers might have forced the adoption of civil service merit systems in one city after another, but in New York, though Tammany might have been forced to make token reforms in other areas of government, civil service was the line at which they stopped. In New York, in 1914, merit was still votes deliverable. The ability that determined who got the jobs and which job holders got promotions and raises was still number of relatives of voting age, or brightness of connections. Under such a system, civil service was chaos. Offices were filled with so many clerks and secretaries that supervisors couldn't possibly provide work for all of them. One secretary might be receiving $25 a week. The secretary at the desk next to hers, doing identical work, might be receiving $47 a week. Some city typists were getting $1,200 a year, others were getting $4,000. When giving tests of the ring the gong variety to candidates for jobs requiring physical strength, lifeguard or fireman, for example, the examiner painted over the candidate's side of the dial which registered the force with which the gong was struck, so that only the examiner could see the results. And the results, the examiner reported frequently, had a relationship less to strength than to the amount of money the candidate pressed into his hands. More than 1,200 employees had been exempted from any competitive examination at all. No aspect of city mismanagement was more frustrating to reformers than civil service maladministration. What good were campaigns to change the government if the people running it, administering its machinery, were still the same unqualified, inefficient, indifferent political hacks? Coffees. Mayor John Perroy Mitchell's announcement that he intended to clean up the civil service, therefore, was especially cheering to reformers. The impeccability of the reform credentials of the two men he selected to form the majority on the three-member Municipal Civil Service Commission, new chairman Henry Moskowitz, a meek, disheveled social worker who had been the first head worker of Bella and Emmanuel Moses' Madison House, and banker Darwin R. James, a natty, one-time Princeton track captain and president of the Brooklyn Bureau of Charities, cemented their optimism. Samuel H. Ordway, chairman of the Civil Service Reform Association, said, "We expect great things, a real advance in civil service administration." But generations of Tammany civil service commissioners, masters in their own way to the art of government, had been there first. Anxious to blaze a path straight to the door of rectitude, Moskowitz and James found themselves trapped instead in a maze of technicalities constructed over decades, primarily to keep great things from happening. Civil service administration, the two reformers soon realized, was an art and a science, and it was an art and a science they knew absolutely nothing about. Not trusting longtime Commission Secretary Frank A. Spencer or Spencer's assistants to lead them out of the maze, Moskowitz and James tried to fire them, learned to their frustration that one of the technicalities prevented this, and settled for transferring them to other departments. And they turned to the young man from the Municipal Research Bureau as their guide. From a technical standpoint, they made a good choice. Two men who had read Moses's thesis, it had been published, were Luther C. Stewart, first president of the National Federation of Federal Employees, and H. Elliott Kaplan, later president of the New York Civil Service Commission and executive director of the Civil Service Reform Association. There are so many names in this book. I wonder, I would love to do a guess how many names are in this book challenge. It's probably thousands. Years later, when Kaplan had read everything there was to read on civil service, he was asked to evaluate the thesis, and he said simply, "It was a masterpiece." There were, he said, very few people in the United States in 1914 who knew much about civil service. Bob Moses really knew. Stewart's wife, who had been working beside her husband in 1914, was even more empathetic. Quote, "Bob Moses wasn't one of the men in this country who understood civil service best at that stage," she said. "He was the man who understood it best." James and Moskowitz asked Moses for a plan of action. Moses said that the first step had to be a reform of the city's efficiency rating system, the system of ratings given by supervisors to their subordinates to help determine whether to promote a civil service employee or give him a pay raise. Under the present method, ratings didn't give the Civil Service Commission enough info for a sound judgment. Making an evaluation system precise was perhaps the most difficult job in civil service, Moses explained. Each job had to be broken down into component parts so that each part could be graded, and in totaling the grades, each part had to be given a mathematical weight corresponding to its importance in the job as a whole. But he knew how to do it, he said. Impressed, James and Moskowitz told him to go ahead and let it be known that they were considering bringing the bureau staffer into city employ and starting him off at the top as Spencer's replacement as commission secretary. Then, one morning, Bob Moses found his name in a newspaper. "Only gentlemen need apply," a headline said. "That is Moses's theory of civil service requirements." Things are heating up. Because he is being considered as a likely successor to Frank Spencer, said the article under the headline, Moses's PhD thesis, of which he acknowledges the authorship and in which he openly advocates that positions in the government service should be open only to university men and gentlemen who had inherited breeding and culture, has caused a mild sensation in civil service circles. You know, when they start talking about inherited breeding, things are going bad places. It was a small article, 5 paragraphs in the Brooklyn Eagle, and no other paper bothered to pick it up. But it must have served as a warning into the Mitchell administration of the line of attack that would be used if Moses was appointed, and of Moses's peculiar vulnerability because of the thesis of which he acknowledges the authorship to such an attack. There was no more talk of the appointment. Side note, I'm very curious how Robert Caro, the author of the book, I'm curious how he found the newspaper mentions because like today I'm just thinking about the Brooklyn Eagle, which hasn't been published in decades, maybe longer. But I just searched on newspapers.com, but I'm curious how well the library would index things like that. Pre-digital world is a mystery to me. The article marked the first appearance of Moses's name in a New York newspaper. Like, how do you know that before computers? It was his first direct acquaintance with a newspaper leak. To the average reader, it would seem that a reporter had discovered the thesis himself, or had been motivated to look for it because of the mild sensation he had noticed in civil service circles. But there had been no sensation, mild or otherwise, over Moses's rumored appointment. Hardly anyone in city government even knew who he was. Actually, Tammany, had simply done a little research and tipped off a reporter to the existence of the thesis and had told him what he would find if he went up to the public library and looked at it. After its publication, the thesis, it became a family joke that only 6 copies had been sold, 3 to Bob's mother and 3 to his grandmother. The story could be taken as a first of another type, too, a first hint of what was to come, a gentle intimidation that politics, in its own way, was rougher than water polo. That the race Bob Moses was entering was not a swimming relay in which the judges watched the touch-offs to ensure that everything was fair. It could be taken as a reminder of how important patronage was to Tammany, far too important to let anyone take it away. Disposing of a young man's hopes for a minor city appointment was so simple it was hardly worth mentioning. A little newspaper leak, done offhand by some politician who had more important things on his mind, could take care of that. Were the threat to grow more serious, however, there were other methods. If it was a hint, however, Moses didn't take it. He would have liked Spencer's job. I don't know who Spencer is. But the job wasn't what was important to him. Reforming the civil service was. He set out to do it. The Bureau assigned 10 men to Moses as assistants. The idea of working under him didn't appeal to the older men, but the younger ones, who hadn't known him before, they liked him. He worked all of us hard, one of them recalls, but he worked himself harder. He was at the Bureau when you got there in the morning, and he was still there when you left at night. He'd lose his temper, but it was so silly to argue with him anyway, because you knew darn well that he had looked the point up before he talked to you, and knew it better than you did. Moses's assistants sat for days watching city workers perform their jobs so that they could break each job down into gradable components. They observed employees of private businesses. They interviewed department heads and civil service commissioners in other cities. Soon memos addressed to Dr. Moses were flooding onto his desk. By the spring of 1915, he was able to begin writing the italics detailed report on the rating of the efficiency of civil service employees, excepting members of the uniformed forces in the police and fire services and in the lower ranks of the street cleaning service. Day after day, he sat in the bureau, his fine-pointed pen racing over the pages of yellow legal notepads. Often, coming across a point he wanted to check himself, he would fling himself out of his chair and point out of the bureau offices and stride, sometimes breaking in his haste into a few steps of a run, and then self-consciously checking himself and setting back into a walk over to City Hall or the municipal building where he could see records and officials himself. Soon, to save time, he asked for and was given a desk of his own in the Civil Service Commission offices on the 14th floor of the municipal building, his first toehold in the halls of power. He wrote and rewrote sections of the report before sending them off to the typist. And when they returned, the fine-pointed pen slashed at the neat pages, crossing out words, putting in others, clarifying, refining, hardening. On July 8, 1915, after 19 months of work, he typed on a bureau letterhead, "Dear Commissioner James, I am transmitting herein detailed report, ... One second. I sort of lost my page just there. That was bad. Under the present system, Moses reported most department heads simply gave each of their hundreds of employees C or average ratings on their report cards, rather than try to pinpoint outstanding or delinquent workers. To obtain more accurate ratings, he wrote, department heads must be required to give each employee arithmetical grades in dozens of categories. In addition, there must be a complete reclassification of the civil service, adding many new levels to ensure that employees would be given the precise salary and authority they deserved. There must be a complete standardization of salaries so that employees doing the same type of work would be getting the same pay, even if they were working in different departments. The Commission should have authority to see that the promotions and raises were given strictly on the basis established under the system. Moses's proposal was the codification of idealism. Omitted, at the insistence of Moskowitz and James, was any mention of higher division, lower division, or university men. There was to be only one standard for promotion in public life: open competition. How hard and well a man worked, and how he performed on examinations. Examination results would be posted in public, and report cards would be open to public inspection so that every city employee would know the basis whereon he and his competitors were judged. Wait, that's kind of crazy. Your entire report card being public. Seniority would become unimportant, not experience, but ability would be crucial. I'm going to do one more paragraph. The proposal was of a purity, a strength, and a scope that was almost more religious than governmental. The system was to be completely new, Moses said. All traces of the old must be washed away, and it must be all-embracing. All government service, he said, could be divided into 16 categories, and they're all listed. Executive, legislative, judicial, professional, subprofessional, educational, investigational, inspectional, clerical, custodial, street cleaning, fire, police, institutional, skilled trades, and labor. Each category could be divided into specific jobs. Custodial, for example, into caretakers, janitors, watchmen, storekeepers, and bridge tenders. I want to be a bridge tender. Each job could be scientifically analyzed to show its functions and responsibilities. Each function and responsibility, and there were dozens of them for most jobs, could be given a precise mathematical weight corresponding to its importance in the overall job. And the success of the employee in each function and responsibility could be given a precise mathematical grade. These grades would, added together according to weight and combined in service records for each employee, furnish conclusions expressed in arithmetical terms, and these conclusions, and these alone, should be used as a basis for salary increase and promotion. Okay, I'm actually going to read more paragraphs because I'm invested now. It was the proposal of a fanatic, John Calvin. John Calvin. Okay. John Calvin, specifying permissible arrangements for women's hair in 16th century Geneva, was not more thorough than was Bob Moses enumerating the functions and responsibilities of New York's civil servants. No aspect of conduct on the job was too small to be graded. Even personality must be reduced to number. Personality, Moses said, includes those intangible elements, the existence of which do not readily admit or proof, but nevertheless, each employee must be rated on personality. Men would have to make sacrifices for the sake of the system, acknowledging that some present employees would not score high enough on his tests for the jobs they held. He had a simple solution. Such employees would have to accept demotions and pay cuts. Unnecessary employees, he said, would have to be eliminated. Yeah, John Calvin as in Calvinism. He says this as if it's like a figure of speech, but I had no idea that John Calvin had like thoroughly enumerated women's hairstyles. I think that Robert Caro assumes that I'm much more educated on like Protestantism than I am. The idealism was harsh and uncompromising. In judging the ability of an examining officer, said one of Moses's aides, echoing Moses's views, a pretty fair clue is the number of below standard ratings given. The more below standard ratings, the better the examining officer. If there could be such a thing as Calvinistic civil service efficiency rating system, Moses had devised it. Moses did not deny there was a human element involved. He knew of its existence all too well. It was constantly interfering with the mathematical perfection of his system, and it must be suppressed. It is essential, he said, to have a definite, almost a mechanical, program of adjustments in order to avoid personal and political pressure. For some reason, it was hard to make examiners understand this. They were always becoming sympathetic to individuals and talking about the human factor, and an examiner who always wishes to take the human factor into consideration is a dangerous man to associate with such work. The considerations of the human factor is entirely a matter of policy for policy determining bodies in applying salary and grade specifications. I don't know what that quote was from. Oh, Moses said that. The infusion of people, moreover, was always interfering with the work to be done. Annoyed that his recommendations had to be discussed at public hearings, he noted that because of the time he had spent at such hearings, it is difficult to keep the field work running smoothly and correspondence up to date. There must, he said, be some limit to public discussion. It's so interesting that his first thing is like having that grading system for public employees, because he was hired because his mom knew people from the bureau. And remember when they were going to fire him and then he worked for free? Kind of a little bit ironic. I'm actually going to do one more paragraph now. Shining through all Moses' statements was confidence, a faith that his system would work, a belief that the personalities of tens of thousands of human beings could be reduced to mathematical grades, that promotions and raises could be determined by a science precise enough to give every one of those human beings the exact rewards he deserved. Asked once if it might not prove difficult to divide a job like that of janitor into different levels based on different functions and responsibilities, Moses replied flatly that it would not be difficult at all. To the expert, he said, such differences are clearly discernible. When somebody ventured to argue that it might be hard to bring under his system appointees in policymaking posts because policymaking ability was too subtle to measure, Moses could barely restrain his impatience. There is no reason why it cannot be worked out in that way, he said. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop. I know that Ivy League interviews still give you a score on your personality, like out of 10 or something. And there's a law where you can, that one student data law, you can see your FERPA maybe. You can be able to see what the reviewers scored you. The government makes it so that they have to do that. Okay, we're on like the middle to end of page 76. I know that there's the podcast 99% Invisible is doing a little series about this book, and I don't know when their episode comes out, but in their episode, they're talking to Robert Caro about the first 90-ish pages. So that's part of the reason I wanted to read today, because I average like 10 pages a day, I used to think, but I'm actually averaging more like 9 or 8, which is not great. I might not get to 90 until Saturday. Oh, actually, it's fine. It's totally fine. There's a bunch of pages that are blank. Okay, well, I hope that you guys have a good day. Thanks for tuning in. I'm still having fun. I really do, I really do think that I'm going to finish. Unless YouTube shuts me down because of copyright. Bye. Thanks, Jake. Have you read this book before? I'm curious. I feel like depending on the day, like sometimes people in the chat talk about things that happen later in the book. Like it's people that just wanted to enjoy a little part of the book even though they already read it. Oh, you don't know anything about US politics? This is like, okay, yeah, I personally like used to think that I knew like a decent amount about New York history because I went to the Museum of the City of New York like 3 times. But this book has really shown me that I didn't. It goes in crazy amounts of depth. Well, I don't know very much about actually, yeah, I have a list of things that I like really need to learn about. And one of my biggest knowledge gaps is British history. I feel like there's a bunch of really basic stuff in British history that I just like genuinely like don't know about. I didn't learn about William the Conqueror until I was like, I think, like, around COVID times, I was an adult. I feel like he's a pretty basic figure. I should have known, but I didn't. I just never took, in school, I don't know what Horrible Histories is. Maybe I should tune in. I have horrible history. I never took AP European History, and a lot of my friends took that in high school, and so, I always blamed that for my gaps in knowledge, but I don't know. Oh, it's a children's TV show in the UK with incredible songs? Ooh, okay, I'm gonna tune into that. That kind of reminds me of, Schoolhouse Rock is a TV show in the States that would air. It was full of songs, but it would air, on, like, public TV in the 70s and 80s, maybe 90s, and so my parents' generation knows it pretty well, but I feel like people today kind of recognize it at least. But yeah, it was, like, a lot of government stuff. Schoolhouse Rock. It was pretty fun, I liked it a lot. So this sounds like it maybe is similar. I will check out Horrible Histories, and then, maybe that will help me be less ignorant of all of the British Isles. See you later.